The Forgotten Cell. The asteroid prison was old and forgotten by most of the galaxy, but it still held its silence and its secrets carved deep into rock and steel. In the deepest level of the prison, far from the noise of guards and the occasional new arrivals, a single cell remained locked for centuries. Inside sat the last human, though no one in the galaxy truly remembered what humanity had been. The guards whispered about him. Some called him a myth. Others avoided even walking near the reinforced doors. Yet he was real, breathing slowly in the dark as years passed him by. His name had been erased by history. Even his number in the prison registry was hidden under a code of silence. But he remembered who he was. He remembered Earth burning. He remembered the sound of ships falling from the sky as alien fleets rained destruction upon his home. He remembered the faces of his family as they disappeared in fire and smoke. Those memories never left him, and in the stillness of the cell they became his strength. The cell itself was small, no larger than a storage room, with walls scarred by old attempts at scratching marks of time. He had stopped marking the days long ago because time had no meaning when centuries felt like weeks. The aliens who built the prison thought it would break him, that silence and isolation would reduce him to nothing. But they never understood humans. Where others gave up, humans endured. Where silence crushed minds, humans found ways to fill it. He spoke to himself, replaying stories, running through old songs, whispering tactics of battles long gone. He kept his mind alive, and though his body bore the marks of chains and neglect, his eyes still burned with a fire that frightened those who dared to look at him. The guards who patrolled the lower corridors were from species that had never fought a human. They knew the stories from their ancestors who described humans as dangerous predators, not because of claws or fangs, but because of their relentless will. Even so, these guards mocked the prisoner when out of earshot, saying he was just an old relic who would die in the shadows. Yet not one of them dared open the cell door without at least 3 others at their side. They felt the weight of his presence even through the metal barrier, as if something in him reached out like a predator's gaze in the night. Rumors about him spread beyond the prison walls. Traders passing near the asteroid would tell tales in low voices about the last human being held in chains. Some said he could break steel with his hands. Others claimed he could stare into your eyes and know your every fear. No one really knew, but the galaxy loved rumors, and those rumors kept his legend alive even when the Council of Worlds wished it forgotten. For the Council, humanity had been a problem solved. Earth had been destroyed, survivors scattered, and eventually silence fell over the memory of humans. They did not want to admit one had survived, for that survival alone was proof that humans could never be erased so easily. Inside the cell, the man sat cross-legged against the cold floor, his back straight though age should have bent him. He felt the vibrations of engines from the distant docking bay. He smelled the faint oil from alien machinery carried through the vents. His senses remained sharp, trained through decades of waiting. He knew something was happening beyond the walls, something bigger than the usual routine. Guards moved more often. Their voices anxious and scraps of conversation reached him even through thick metal. Words like war, invasion, and council drifted into his ears, and with each one his heartbeat grew stronger. For so long he had been silent, waiting, watching, letting the galaxy forget him. Now for the first time in centuries he felt the stirring of purpose. The galaxy thought him dead in all but name, a prisoner locked away until the end of time, but he knew better. He was alive, and as long as one human still lived, the story of humanity was not over. He pressed his hand against the cold steel of the wall, feeling its weight, and whispered to himself not with despair but with quiet certainty. The galaxy had forgotten what it meant to face a human, but soon they would remember the Council's mistake. The Galactic Council gathered in the Great Chamber, a hall larger than most planets could dream of building, where walls of crystal shimmered with the light of thousands of stars. Representatives from every corner of the galaxy filled their seats, their voices rising in waves as they argued about the war that had already stretched across systems. The threat came from an enemy unlike any they had faced before, a relentless swarm of conquerors who spread from one world to another without pause, devouring fleets and colonies. Entire species had vanished under their onslaught, and even the most powerful empires could not withstand them alone. The chamber was filled with fear, though few dared admit it openly. Instead, hiding behind pride and bluster, the Speaker of the Council, An elder being with silver scales and eyes that glowed like molten fire struck the staff against the floor and demanded silence. One by one, ambassadors rose to speak of strategies, of weapons, of alliances, but none offered a solution that could truly stop the enemy tide. They had fleets and they had armies, but they lacked something greater, something they could not name. Whispers of despair echoed in the corners where aides and scribes watched in silence. For all their technology, for all their wisdom, the council felt powerless. Then a voice broke through, sharp and steady, belonging to an old advisor whose people had once lived close to human colonies before Earth was destroyed. He rose slowly, his robes trailing along the polished floor, and when he spoke, the chamber fell silent. He said there had been a time when humans fought wars with a fury the galaxy had never seen, that even when their worlds burned, they fought on, that their resilience was unmatched. He reminded them that the swarm which now threatened them all was not the first enemy to try and erase civilizations, and in those days, humans had stood at the front lines. His words carried unease, for to speak of humans in that chamber was like summoning ghosts. The council had declared them extinct long ago, an inconvenience removed from the path of order. The speaker narrowed his glowing eyes and asked why the advisor chose to summon old legends when they faced a crisis of the present. The advisor hesitated, then delivered a revelation that rippled through the hall like thunder. He said there was a rumor, one passed between traders and smugglers, that a single human yet lived, imprisoned in an asteroid facility on the edge of council territory. The chamber erupted in noise, voices shouting disbelief, laughter, denial, and fear. Some called it nonsense, a tale for children, but others looked uneasy, for they had heard whispers of the same. One ambassador, a tall insectoid with gleaming chitin, struck the floor with its claws and mocked the idea. It asked what one human could possibly do when entire fleets had failed, when billions had already been lost to the swarm. Another, a reptilian warlord draped in ceremonial armor, growled that if such a prisoner existed, he should be executed at once, for nothing good could come from awakening humanity again. Yet the chamber was divided, for some remembered the warnings their ancestors had given, that humans were both a curse and a salvation, feared because they could never be broken. The speaker raised his staff once more and demanded quiet. He declared that humanity was gone, and that the council must focus on building alliances, not chasing shadows. Still his eyes betrayed unease and his voice trembled despite his authority. The advisor bowed, but before sitting down he spoke one last sentence that silenced even the loudest voices. He said that perhaps the council had made its greatest mistake, not in fighting the swarm but in erasing the very predators who could have fought it for them. The words lingered in the air, heavy and sharp. When the session ended, the ambassadors left the chamber in waves of murmurs and arguments. Outside, aides rushed to carry reports to their fleets and rulers, but many carried also the seed of doubt. If a human truly lived, if the last of their kind remained breathing in chains, then perhaps the balance of the war was not yet set. The idea frightened them as much as it intrigued them. In the quiet corridors beyond the chamber, whispers spread faster than official decrees. Humanity, forgotten and buried, might still cast its shadow over the galaxy. Far from the shining halls of the council, in the forgotten asteroid prison, the man in the cell stirred once more. Though he could not see the chamber or hear the words spoken within, something deep inside told him the galaxy was speaking his name again, even if only as a rumor. He felt the weight of centuries pressing forward, shaping into something inevitable. The council thought him myth or mistake, but he knew the truth. They would remember soon, whether they wished it or not. The awakening. The prisoner awoke in the same darkness he had known for so long, yet something felt different, as if the air itself carried tension. For centuries his body had endured hunger and chains and silence, but this day his senses sharpened, as if his blood remembered it was not meant to rest forever. He rose slowly from the cold floor and listened carefully. Beyond the thick steel he could hear the steps of guards, heavier and faster than usual. Voices carried through the vents, though. Muffled and hurried, words like invasion and fleet and emergency reached him in fragments. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, letting those fragments paint the picture in his mind. The galaxy was burning again, and once more they were afraid. He remembered the day Earth fell. He had been younger then, strong and unbroken, a soldier who fought until the skies themselves collapsed. He remembered the smell of smoke and the sound of explosions that shook the ground until buildings crumbled like sand. He remembered the eyes of his comrades when they realized no help was coming and no one would save them. Yet even in that despair they fought on, he carried those memories with him like scars carved deeper than any wound. They had tried to erase his people, to bury them in silence, but his memory refused to fade. The guards outside argued more loudly now, and one of them dropped a tray of equipment that clattered against the floor. Their voices trembled though they tried to sound brave. He smiled faintly in the dark, for fear could not be hidden from him. He had smelled fear in battlefields. He had seen it in the eyes of enemies, and he could taste it now through the walls. Something had shaken them deeply, perhaps the same swarm that the council whispered about. They thought him forgotten, but the universe was giving him signs. His time was not yet over. As hours passed, the vibrations of ships docking above reached through the stone. He felt them in his bones. His instincts sharpened like a blade honed by fire. He stretched his arms against the chains and tested their strength. They had held him for longer than any creature should survive, yet they felt weaker than before, perhaps rusted by time, perhaps weakened by his constant quiet effort. He had never stopped training in silence, pushing his body against the restraints, keeping muscle and will alive when most would have wasted away. He was not as strong as the young man who once fought on Earth, but he was sharper, harder, built of patience and pain. Later, one guard came closer to his cell, whispering to another that the council was debating the fate of the prisoner. The words sent heat through his chest. So they remembered after all. He pressed his ear against the wall and caught the guard's voice trembling as he said the council feared the stories, feared that if the prisoner was released he could rally others or bring chaos. The other guard only laughed nervously and said that one man could do nothing. The prisoner smiled again, the kind of smile that carried no joy but only quiet promise. One man had often been enough. He thought of the human spirit, the endless will to resist, the refusal to surrender even when crushed. He thought of how predators hunted not because of strength alone but because of cunning, because of strategy, because of the hunger to win at any cost. That was what the galaxy had never understood. They thought humans were fragile because their bodies lacked claws and fangs, but they never understood that the human weapon was deeper, hidden in mind and soul. In his cell he felt that weapon stir again, an old fire reigniting after centuries of ash. The alarms of the prison blared suddenly, echoing through every corridor. Red lights flashed through the tiny cracks in the door. Guards shouted orders in panic. Somewhere above, explosions shook the asteroid. The prisoner stood tall, chains rattling as he tightened his fists. He could almost feel the universe tearing open, demanding that he step back into it. He whispered to himself words that no guard could hear, a vow spoken in silence. They believed they had buried humanity in darkness, but they had only planted it. Now it was ready to rise again. The escape. The alarms screamed through the corridors of the asteroid prison, and the guards rushed in every direction, their voices filled with confusion and fear. The prisoner stood in his dark cell, his head tilted slightly as if he listened, not with his ears but with every nerve in his body. Explosions rumbled through the structure and dust shook from the ceiling above him. The universe was moving, and he knew that the moment he had waited for was finally at hand. He pulled against the chains once more, not with reckless anger, but with steady strength gathered over years of patient training. The iron groaned and the cuffs cut into his skin, yet he pressed harder until the sound of snapping metal echoed in the small chamber. For the first time in centuries, he was free of his restraints. He touched the wall of the cell, his fingertips tracing the cold steel as if it were an old enemy. Then he stepped back, braced his body, and slammed his shoulder into the weakened section where rust and time had done what no weapon could. The wall cracked, then burst outward under the force of a man who refused to remain forgotten. He stepped into the corridor, his bare feet silent against the floor, his eyes burning with the fire of purpose. The guards who turned the corner froze at the sight of him, their weapons shaking in their hands. They had heard stories, but none had truly believed until that moment. The human stood tall despite the chains still clinging to his wrists and the scars carved into his flesh. One guard shouted and fired, but the human moved faster than their eyes could follow. He closed the distance in a breath and struck with precision, breaking the weapon from the guard's grasp and sending the alien crashing against the wall. The others stumbled backward, fear plain in their eyes. They had been trained to fight criminals and rebels, but not predators who moved with such ruthless efficiency. The prisoner did not hesitate. He seized a fallen weapon and turned it against them, with skill born from battlefields long lost to history. When the corridor fell silent once more, the guards lay unconscious, and the human walked onward, his movements calm and measured, as though this was not escape but destiny. The prison shook again as another explosion thundered through the asteroid. Emergency lights flashed along the corridors, painting his figure in crimson and shadow. He advanced step by step, memorizing the layout from the vibrations of footsteps and the echoes of panicked voices. He did not need maps because his mind drew patterns from chaos, and every sound told him where the next path lay. More guards tried to block him, but they faltered when they met his gaze. It was not only strength that broke them, but the weight of his presence, the certainty that they were prey facing a predator who would not stop. He dismantled their defenses with speed and precision, never wasting energy, never giving them a chance to regroup. Word spread quickly through the prison that the human was loose. Some guards abandoned their posts entirely, fleeing toward the docking bays in terror. Others tried to rally, but their courage cracked each time a corridor filled with silence after his passage. To them, he was no longer a prisoner, but a shadow of death moving freely through their stronghold. Panic consumed them faster than any weapon. The man who had waited in chains for centuries now walked like a storm through the heart of their fear. He reached the central control chamber and tore open the doors. The officers inside stared at him with wide eyes, their hands frozen above consoles. Without speaking, he seized one by the collar and demanded information in a voice that carried not rage but cold command. The officer stammered about the war outside, about the swarm overwhelming the galaxy, about the council, debating what to do with him. The human listened in silence, then released the terrified alien, who stumbled backward as if spared by a predator who chose not to feed. He turned toward the consoles and with surprising ease began to understand their systems. Human minds had always adapted quickly, and though centuries had passed, his instinct for technology remained sharp. He overrode locks, released pressure doors, and shut down surveillance. When the alarms shifted from warning of invasion to signaling breach, the entire prison realized it was no longer under their control. The human had not only escaped but claimed command of the fortress from within. Standing in the glow of alien screens, he lifted his gaze to the ceiling and spoke softly to himself. The galaxy thought humanity was gone, but they would learn that one survivor was enough to shatter their certainty. His escape was not just freedom, it was the opening of a door the galaxy had tried to seal forever. Now the door stood wide and nothing would hold him back. The alliance of fear, human, had claimed the prison as his own, and the guards who survived fled into the outer corridors, leaving the asteroid fortress trembling with silence. From the control chamber, he studied the flow of data on the alien screens. Ships moved above the asteroid, exchanging fire, with an enemy swarm that poured across the system. He understood then why the Council had grown desperate, for the swarm was unlike anything he had seen since the fall of Earth. They moved with no hesitation, no diplomacy, no mercy, and wherever they passed, only silence remained. Yet the human felt no fear as he watched their patterns. He felt only the old hunger of battle rising again within him. News of his escape reached the Council faster than they expected. Messengers carried word that the prisoner not only lived but had broken free and taken control of the asteroid fortress. The chamber of the Council was filled with panic as ambassadors shouted over one another, some demanding his death, and others urging negotiation. They feared him as much as they feared the swarm, for the memory of humanity was still carved into their history, though they had tried to bury it. The speaker struck his staff upon the floor, but even his voice trembled as he declared that a delegation would be sent to speak with the human. It was a choice made not from trust but from necessity, for the swarm threatened to crush them all. The delegation arrived under heavy escort, their ships circling the asteroid as if prepared to fire should he resist. Yet when they entered the fortress, they found the human waiting calmly in the command chamber, his figure framed by the glow of alien consoles. He did not rise to greet them, but simply watched with eyes that cut through every layer of their fear. The leader of the delegation spoke with practiced authority, offering him freedom in exchange for his help in the war against the swarm. The human listened silently, his face unreadable. At last he stood and spoke, his voice steady and cold. He reminded them that when Earth had burned, no council ships came to help, no fleets rose to defend humanity. He told them that his people had been left to die alone, and that the council now asked for aid only because they themselves stood on the edge of ruin. His words made the delegation shift uneasily, their pride clashing with the truth of his accusation. They tried to explain that the council had acted for stability, that sacrifices had to be made, but their excuses fell empty in the chamber. The human considered them for a long moment. He had every reason to reject them, every reason to let the swarm consume the galaxy that had betrayed his people. Yet within him the memory of Earth stirred again, not in bitterness but in the sense of duty that had once driven his kind to fight against impossible odds. He knew the swarm would not stop with the council or its empires. They would spread beyond until nothing remained. If he allowed them to win, then the extinction of humanity would truly be complete. He agreed to help, but his terms were harsh. He demanded command authority over any fleets placed under his direction. He demanded supplies and soldiers trained to follow his orders without interference, and he warned them that betrayal would be answered with a fury greater than the swarm itself. The delegation hesitated, but they saw no other choice. They returned to the council with his conditions, and though many protested, the speaker finally declared that they must accept. Thus began the alliance of fear. The council did not trust him, and he did not trust them, yet both sides understood the necessity. Fleets began to gather under his direction. Alien captains forced to submit to a human who had lived longer in chains than they had lived in freedom. Whispers spread across the galaxy that the last human walked free and now commanded armies. Some celebrated as if a savior had risen. Others trembled as if an ancient monster had returned. The galaxy had forgotten the will of humanity, but it was about to learn once again why humans were never truly defeated. Humanity's shadow, then. Fleets gathered under the command of the last human filled the void of space with the glow of engines and the sharp edges of warships. Alien captains stood at attention, though their pride burned within them, for they had never before been ordered by a single man, yet the weight of necessity pressed them into silence. In the central command vessel, the human stood before the strategic table, studying the patterns of the swarm, as it devoured worlds without hesitation. His eyes followed the shifting lines of battle, not with panic but with calculation. Where others saw hopeless chaos, he saw weakness hidden in the waves of destruction. He issued orders with a voice that carried the authority of experience. The fleets were to strike not in the blunt ways the council had always attempted, but with precision and misdirection. He sent small forces to lure the swarm into traps, guiding them into corridors of space where ambushes waited. He used terrain of nebulae and asteroid fields in ways alien commanders had never dared, for his mind was forged on a world where survival required risk. The fleets obeyed, though many doubted, yet when the first battles ended, the swarm bled for the first time. Ships that once crushed everything in their path now fell into fire as the humans' traps closed upon them. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded. Among the soldiers who fought under him, stories spread quickly. They whispered that he was not like any being they had ever seen. He did not command from safety, but often stood at the edge of battle himself, his presence filling warriors with courage, even as fear gnawed at their hearts. They saw how he endured without rest, how his eyes never wavered from the enemy, and how his strategies always seemed 2 steps ahead. Some began to call him a ghost of war, others a predator wearing human flesh, but all agreed he carried the shadow of something greater than any single being. The swarm adapted quickly, as they always did, but so did he. Each time they changed their formations, he altered his own. Each time they brought new horrors to the field, he found new ways to break them. Alien commanders marveled and feared him, for his thinking was ruthless in ways they had never considered. Where they sought honorable battles, he sought only victory. Where they hesitated to sacrifice, he cut away weakness, without regret. His methods horrified them, yet they could not deny his results. The swarm that had crushed their fleets now recoiled before the cunning of a single human mind. Yet behind the victories, the council whispered in fear. Ambassadors gathered in secret chambers, speaking of how dangerous he had become. They admitted quietly that if he turned against them, none of their fleets could stand. The speaker listened with unease, knowing that they had awakened not only a savior, but a threat beyond measure. They debated betrayal already, even as his victories saved their worlds. Some argued that once the swarm was defeated, he must be destroyed before humanity's shadow spread across the stars once again. Others warned that such betrayal could doom them all, for his vengeance would be beyond imagining. The human himself knew their thoughts, though they never spoke them aloud. He saw it in their eyes when they stood before him with forced smiles, and in the hesitation of their words. He carried no illusions of trust, for he had lived too long in chains to believe in promises. Yet he did not strike at them, for now he needed their fleets and they needed his will. He allowed the whispers to grow, knowing that fear itself was a weapon as sharp as any blade. He was the last of his kind, and already he stood as both commander and warning, a living reminder that humanity was not extinct, but watching from the shadows. As more battles raged, the galaxy changed. Species who once laughed at the myths of humans now spoke with reverence or terror. Children heard tales of the prisoner who broke chains and led armies against the darkness. Merchants carried stories from system to system, describing how the human outthought the swarm again and again. To some he was a savior, to others a monster, but to all he was proof that the galaxy had been wrong to forget his people. His very existence reshaped the balance of power, and the council knew it even if they dared not say it aloud. The war was far from over, but already the galaxy trembled at the shadow he cast. One man had become an army and one survivor had become a legend. Yet he knew that the true battle was still to come, for the swarm had not yet unleashed its full strength, and the council whispered of betrayal in darkened halls. Between those threats he stood alone, the last human, carrying the weight of extinction on his shoulders and wielding it as a weapon against the stars. The swarm came in numbers beyond counting their ships, blotting out the light of stars as they descended upon the system, where the human had drawn the line. The fleets of the council stood in formation, waiting with trembling engines, their captains silent as they watched the endless wave approach. In the command vessel, the human stood at the center of the bridge, his hands resting on the console, his eyes calm, though around him, even seasoned officers shook with fear. He had chosen this system not because it was strong, but because it was where the swarm would believe victory was certain. He wanted them to come with all their strength, and he wanted the galaxy to see what one human could do when all hope was gone. He gave the order, and the fleets moved with precision never seen before under the council. Smaller ships darted ahead like bait, leading the swarm into narrow corridors of space, where asteroid fields drifted and nebula storms crackled with hidden energy. The swarm pursued with blind hunger, and as they entered those traps, the human unleashed the full weight of his strategy. Mines hidden within the rocks ignited in chains of fire, tearing through their numbers. Ion bursts from concealed vessels shattered their formations, and before the swarm could recover, heavy cruisers swept in from the flanks, cutting deep into their masses. The void erupted in fire as the swarm bled in ways they had never bled before, but the swarm adapted quickly as always, and soon they poured forward with renewed fury, breaking through lines and hammering the fleets with sheer weight. Alien captains cried out in despair, but the human's voice cut through their panic like steel. He commanded them to hold steady, to trust the pattern, to remember that fear was the enemy as much as the swarm itself. His presence steadied them, and where they might have broken, they fought on. Hours passed, and the battle stretched like eternity, ships burning in every direction, the void filled with wreckage, and screams carried over comms. Still the human stood unshaken, guiding every move as if he had already seen the outcome. Then, the heart of the swarm appeared, a colossal ship larger than cities, pulsing with the power of a hive mind that directed the rest. It advanced slowly, unstoppable in size and might, its weapons cutting through entire fleets with single blasts. The council ambassadors watching from distant worlds despaired, believing the end had come. Yet the human only narrowed his eyes and gave the order that no alien had dared even imagine. He commanded his fleet to break apart, not in retreat but in sacrifice. Smaller ships hurled themselves directly into the path of the hive ship, forcing it to slow, forcing it to adjust as wave after wave struck against its shields. Captains obeyed, not because they wished to die, but because his voice carried the weight of destiny. With the path cleared, the human took command of a single vessel, a captured warship reinforced with the strongest weapons of the council. He piloted it himself, guiding it straight toward the heart of the hive ship. Enemy fire rained down upon him, but he wove through it with the instincts of a predator born for survival. The alien officers who remained on the bridge stared in awe as he pressed forward, never hesitating even as the ship shook under impacts. He carried with him the weight of all humanity and the knowledge that if he fell here, the galaxy would fall with him. He breached the defenses and drove his vessel into the core of the hive ship. Systems screamed around him as he armed every weapon and every explosive charge. Over the comms he spoke not to the council but to the galaxy itself, his voice reaching every fleet and every soldier. He said that humanity was never gone, that humanity was never broken, that even when only one remained, humanity would fight until the stars themselves burned away. Then he unleashed the full fury of his ship, and the hive vessel erupted in light brighter than suns. The explosion tore through the swarm, breaking their unity, shattering their endless coordination. Without the hive ship, they faltered, and the Council fleet surged forward, destroying what remained. The battle turned from despair to victory in a single blaze, and across the galaxy, voices rose in disbelief and awe. The last human had given everything, and in doing so had turned the tide of extinction. When the light faded, there was silence in the void. The wreckage of the swarm drifted among the stars, and the Council fleets gathered in broken triumph. They searched for the human, but his ship was gone, consumed in the explosion. Yet even in death, his shadow remained. The galaxy whispered of him as both savior and threat, as legend and truth. The Council feared him still, yet they could not deny that without him none of them would have survived. He had become more than a man, he had become the memory of humanity carved into the stars. And so the story ended, not with chains and darkness, but with fire that lit the galaxy. The last human prisoner had risen from silence to become the final hope of countless worlds. Though his body was gone, his will endured, and the galaxy knew it could never again forget humanity. One man had changed everything, and his legend would echo across eternity. The final stand. The swarm advanced like an endless ocean of steel and fire, blotting out the stars with their sheer numbers and hunger. Entire fleets of the Council shuddered under the weight of their presence, and many captains whispered silent prayers as the tide grew near. In the command vessel, the last human stood unshaken, his figure a still point amid chaos, his eyes locked on the vast display of the battlefield. He had waited for this moment through centuries of silence and chains, and now the galaxy would see what it had forgotten. He ordered the fleets into motion, not with desperate cries, but with calm precision. Small ships darted into the path of the swarm, leading them into mazes of asteroid fields and nebula storms, where hidden weapons waited. Mines detonated in cascades of fire, tearing open the flanks of the enemy. Heavy cruisers struck from the shadows, while swift fighters sliced through gaps that only his mind could see. For the first time, the swarm faltered, their perfect advance shaken by strategies no alien had ever dared. The void lit with flame as thousands of their ships fell, yet still. The endless tide pressed forward. The battle stretched for hours, and the Council's fleets bent under the weight. Officers shouted in fear, but the human's voice cut through the calm, steady and unyielding. He told them to hold, to trust, to fight, because fear itself was the true enemy. His presence gave them strength, and though ships burned and soldiers died, they stood longer than they ever had before. Then the great hive vessel emerged, a monstrosity larger than cities, its core glowing with the intelligence that bound the swarm into one. Its weapons unleashed storms of energy that tore through lines as if they were made of paper, and the Council ambassadors, watching from distant systems, despaired, believing the end had finally come. The human studied the hive vessel, his eyes narrowing, not with fear but with resolve. He gave an order no alien commander would ever have spoken. He commanded sacrifice. Smaller ships hurled themselves into the path of the hive vessel, striking its shields again and again until the monster slowed its advance. The captains who obeyed did so not out of loyalty to the Council, but because the human's voice carried the weight of destiny itself. He then took command of a single warship reinforced with weapons stolen from the Council's strongest fleets and piloted it directly toward the hive vessel. Fire rained down upon him, but he wove through it with the instincts of a predator. Forged on a death world where survival meant daring, what no one else would dare, he breached the defenses and drove straight into the core of the hive ship. The vessel shook as alarms screamed and alien officers begged him to turn back. Yet he pressed forward, arming every weapon and every explosive charge. Across the galaxy, his voice echoed through the comms. He told them humanity was never gone, humanity was never broken. Humanity would always fight, even if only one remained. Then he unleashed everything, and the hive vessel erupted in a blaze brighter than suns. The swarm fractured their unity, shattered their endless advance, broken in an instant by the sacrifice of one. The Council's fleets surged forward, destroying the remnants of the swarm. Silence fell across the battlefield as wreckage drifted among stars. The human's ship was gone, consumed by fire and light, yet his presence lingered. Whispers spread through the galaxy that humanity had returned not in numbers but in spirit. To some he was savior, to others a terror, but to all he was legend. The Council feared the memory of him, yet could not deny that without him they would have perished. He had become more than the last prisoner, more than the last soldier. He had become the eternal shadow of humanity, etched into the stars forever. The end.